Our next speaker is Kelsey Lane, and she is a graduate student. She's working on her PhD within the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And so she's going to tell us how big climate-related stories can be told by studying foraminifera, a tiny type of microscopic plankton, excuse me. So Kelsey, you've already shared your screen, so now you can go ahead and begin your presentation.
All right. Hi, everybody. So it sounds like you can see my screen and can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can see your screen and hear your voice.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for being here. I am a graduate student at Oregon State University, and as we have a lot of folks from Oregon in the crowd, you will probably know where I'm located, but I'm in the West Coast. I just completed my master's degree in marine resource management, and now I am working towards my PhD in ocean ecology and biogeochemistry. But I always like to say that geography does need to limit your career opportunities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to becoming an oceanographer, and then I'll talk a bit more about my research. So I'm an oceanographer from a landlocked state. I grew up in the middle of the US in Rapid City, South Dakota. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to South Dakota. But yeah, it's about as far as you can get from the ocean. And so when I was a little girl, I dreamed of studying dolphins in the ocean. And I think a lot of people, really get enamored with the ocean when they're young. I'd only probably been to the ocean, maybe once or twice a year if I was really lucky, but I spent a lot of time on the water. This photo is of me in a canoe, so I spent a lot of time in freshwater on lakes and rivers. And I did a high school science fair project on the water quality of local lakes and rivers. And that really inspired me to pursue environmental science. I really loved art and writing and photography. And it was only when I actually did a science fair project that I realized that science is actually a really creative and collaborative process. So that science fair project, I did science fair a couple years, but 1 year it took me to the International Science Fair. I actually came out to Oregon to Portland. And I just realized, oh, I actually feel a little bit like I'm doing like a creative art when I'm doing science. And so when it came time to go to college, I thought, all right, I want to get out to the coast. Maybe I can study the ocean and maybe I can study ocean science. So I went to college, sorry about that, in Providence, Rhode Island at Brown University. And I got a bachelor's degree in geology and biology. And I definitely say try new subjects and new research areas, because I knew nothing about geology when I was starting out in university. But I wandered into this class and it turned out to be just the coolest department. And I had all these opportunities to travel and learn about the natural world. And I realized, oh man, I'm gonna study the subjects that let me travel and get outside. And so for me, that was studying both geology and marine biology. And there's a lot of really interesting intersections between those two fields. So I'm going to mention some of the things that I did in undergraduate that helped me decide I wanted to become a researcher. And a few of these are opportunities that you can explore as well when you get to college. So my very first research job was working as an intern for a dolphin project that did photo identification and behavioral ecology down in Key West, Florida. So this photo shows me with, I had a really big fancy camera, like a few $1,000 camera, and we would take photographs of bottlenose dolphins and we could identify individuals by their fins. And at this point, I was, I just had 1 or 2 years of college under my belt. I'd never actually really worked on a boat before in my entire life. I'd never been to Florida and I never worked with marine mammals. But I got the job and it was actually a paid job, which is pretty nice in marine mammal research because I had a background in photography. So when they were advertising for the position, I interviewed with them and we just talked and they heard about my experience with photography, which was something that I thought I just did for fun on the side because I like to make art, and it actually helped me get my first job in research. So be sure to highlight your skills, whatever those are, because you might be surprised. Sometimes they're very transferable. And after that first research job, then the next jobs continued. So I went back to Brown and I ended up working in some labs in the ecology department and in the geology department. But the next really influential thing that happened to me is I applied for the Noah Halling Scholarship. So this is a scholarship that is offered by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it actually supports college students for the last 2 years of their undergrad degree. So I had scholarship support for 2 years, and then I got to do a summer internship with NOAA. And this could be based all around the world, mostly all around the country, but there were a few things outside of the US. And I ended up with an internship doing rocky intertidal biodiversity surveys in Homer, Alaska. So this is a photo of me with my quadrat, and I was basically counting a lot of algae and a lot of little critters that lived underneath the kelp and seaweed all around this research reserve in central Alaska. It was really beautiful. I'd never been to Alaska before, and I hadn't really had that many opportunities to do such remote field work where I was regularly going out with just one other college student, and we were just sampling on our own and making up our own sampling plan. And it was, I just realized, oh, okay, this is really what I want to do. And this was a pretty competitive internship because there were a lot of different postings, but a lot of people wanted to go to Alaska to do this kind of research. And the woman who was in charge of this project said that she ended up choosing me and my friend, who are the two interns who worked on this together, because we were both really enthusiastic. So show your enthusiasm. I think there's a lot of people, and I agree with this too, that feel like we can teach you skills, but a really good attitude is hard to teach someone. And the last thing is I studied abroad in college. This might not be an opportunity for everybody, but if you can, it was just a really great opportunity to get out of the United States. I hadn't traveled outside of the US much before I did my study abroad. So I did a program called Sea Semester that is based out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts on the East Coast. And you spend 6 weeks on the Woods Hole campus and you learn, it's a crash course in oceanography, as well as a big crash course in sort of social science and nautical science. And then you spend 6 weeks sailing on one of their 2 tall ships. So I have a photo of the tall ship shown in the top there. And I did a cruise track that sailed from Tahiti in the middle of the South Pacific to Hawaii, which is a couple thousand miles at sea. And one of my favorite moments of that trip was we went to the Marquesas, which are a pretty remote set of islands, not too far from Tahiti. And we had an exchange with a local high school. And so we got to go to this local high school and they were doing a bunch of farming, and they showed us around the farm, and then we brought them back to the ship and showed them the ship, talked about life at sea. And they were incredible musicians. And there's a great tradition there of just a lot of like music and singing. And I am a violinist and a fiddler actually. So I pulled out my instrument and we had the most fun jam session on a quarterdeck on a ship anchored off an island in the middle of the South Pacific. And it was a blast. So that's the lower photo there. So after I graduated, I thought, man, I would really love to do more of that sailing. I'm not sure what I want to do next, but I really like to travel. I really like to go to sea. Maybe I can go work for Sea Semester. So it took me a little while to get to a job at Sea Semester, but I worked on a bunch of different ships as a marine technician and a science educator. And I worked actually on a few boats around Washington and California and on the East Coast. And then ultimately I got a job with Sea Semester, and I got to sail all around the world. So I've put down some of the cruise tracks of the places that I got to sail. These trips were usually around 2 months. So it was about 6 weeks at sea and then a little bit of time in port along the way. And people always ask, and I will say, I do not get seasick. Every once in a while, I definitely feel the motion of the ocean, but it probably helped me to do this job for 7 years that I don't get too seasick. So I spent 7 years sailing all around the world, into the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic Ocean a couple times, spent a lot of time in the Caribbean, and then all around the Pacific. including a couple trips in the very remote South Pacific between New Zealand and Tahiti, where the closest point of land was Antarctica. So that was really fun, and really felt like I was living my dream job, and just doing everything I wanted to do. And then at some point, after about 7 years, I realized, oh, okay, maybe I want to have a house someday, and maybe I don't want to spend 6 to 8 months a year at sea. So I figured out what I wanted to do to transition. I realized the things that I really enjoyed were working with plankton, or little tiny microscopic things that drift in the ocean, and I really liked teaching. So, last thing I wanted to say, actually, sorry, is that there's a lot of really pretty pictures that I can show from the time that I spent at sea, but there's also a lot of hard work that happens. So it looks really glamorous from the outside, but I also was responsible for a lot of the maintenance on the ship. If anything broke in our laboratory, I had to fix it. I did a lot of sample preservation. I spent a lot of time in shipyards. So you can actually see one of the ships that I worked on hauled out, and all the little people that are working around it. Spent a lot of time untangling lines. And when you are at sea for multiple weeks at a time, you work in watches. So I was frequently up in the middle of the night, and never had a very regular sleep schedule. So it might look really fun, but it is also a lot of hard work. But yeah, after about 7 years of sailing, it was time to do something else. So I transitioned and started a new career just a couple years ago as a graduate student, realizing that I was really interested in doing more oceanography and teaching about oceanography. So now I'm a graduate student studying plankton. I still get to go to sea. This is a photo of me on a cruise. I go on probably a couple of research cruises a year. So I probably spend a few weeks a year at sea instead of months a year at sea. And I spend a lot more of my time now working in a laboratory. And I spend a lot of time in a microscope, which I love. And I also spend a lot of time at a computer. But it's been a really fun transition, and I'm so glad that I took the leap into something new. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. I work with planktic foraminifera. So foraminifera are a type of plankton. And again, that means that they are drifters in the surface ocean because they're tiny. So they are just going to get pushed around by ocean currents. And foraminifera are microscopic, which means you can't really see them with your naked eye. And they are unicellular, so they're a single cell, and they have a shell. The species that I study have shells made out of calcium carbonate. There's about 45 species of planktic foraminifera that are alive today. And each of these species is a little bit like Goldilocks. It has a temperature where it likes to live, and they don't like the temperature to be too hot or too cold. So the temperature of the ocean is the primary control on where you find these different species. And this is how we sample plankton, and specifically how I sample foraminifera. So we'll take a net, which has really fine mesh, and we'll dangle it over the side of the ship. We'll go down into the water column and sample the water. We'll bring that sample up, take it into the lab. I work underneath a microscope. This is actually a microscope setup that we did at sea. And then I get to look underneath the microscope at these really beautiful foraminifera. So here's a photo of a bunch of different species of foraminifera, and they are colorful and they have really unique, fun shell shapes. There's a lot of different types of plankton, but the thing that makes foraminifera unique, and I'm showing just a schematic here of a bunch of different types of phytoplankton. So we have these tiny green phytoplankton that are like plants. They're photosynthesizing, they're the base of the food web. They're eaten by larger plankton like these copepods and forams. And then of course we have things that can swim on their own like fish and whales. But because foraminifera have shells, when they die, those shells are dense or heavy enough to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And they end up getting trapped in those deep sea sediments and recorded as fossils. So planktic foraminifera are really valuable storytellers because they can record the ocean conditions from the past. These are actually one of our most valuable tools for understanding the ancient ocean. So the way that we look at foraminifera through time is we would have a ship here, a big drilling platform, and they send either a drill or a heavy weight with a core on it down to the seafloor, and then they drill deep into the ocean. And these are pretty small cores, but they can pull out sediment. And so within that sediment, the younger sediment is closer to the surface. And then as you go deeper and deeper, you get older and older and older. And what's really cool is that you will find foraminifera recorded in these deep sea sediments. So these are just little record keepers for us that can really unlock the stories of the past. So I have been studying foraminifera here off of the Oregon coast, and I've been looking at how marine heat waves have been impacting foraminifera. So marine heat waves are when we get warmer water than normal. It's a lot like a heat wave on land, but it happens in the ocean, and it can last for a few months or up to a couple of years. So we had a dramatic heat wave in Oregon that happened from 2014 to 2016. It was called the warm blob. You might have heard of it. And we've had another more recent marine heat wave just last fall. And what I'm finding is that during the marine heat wave years, we get warmer water species of foraminifera. And that's again because these foraminifera are like Goldilocks. So when the water gets warmer, we're going to see warmer water species that look really different than the colder water species that we see in years when there's not a marine heat wave. And the colder water species are on the right. And we can record marine heat waves right now because we have satellites, we have thermometers, we have a lot of instruments that record temperature. But if we go back in time, we don't have a lot of instruments that can record temperature. So we might actually be able to use foraminifera to help us figure out how frequently did marine heat waves occur in the past in Oregon, because we can see how do these different species change over time. Are we seeing warm water species? Are we seeing colder water species? And so we have a lot of information about the ocean's temperature in the past from foraminifera, and this is really important for predicting the future. So some of the information that we have from foraminifera is also used to help us predict what the future will look like under climate change. So yeah, foraminifera might be tiny plankton, but they tell a really big story about the oceans. Thank you everyone for listening, and I will be happy to take any questions. And if you would like to reach out, feel free to email me. And my lab has a really fun Instagram where we post a lot of pretty pictures of our different plankton that we find and foraminifera that we work with. I have a Twitter as well, and I'd like to thank all of my funding sources and all of my collaborators who've helped me with this research over the years.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. So cool, your path. Like, thank you so much for sharing your path and all of the different opportunities that really contributed to you deciding to what you wanted to do and where you are today. So kind of on that note, we have a question from one of our participants about you did have a lot of opportunities to travel. And so if you can maybe share a little bit more, expand a little bit more on how folks that may be joining us that are about high school age, to look like in our survey. So how can they find those opportunities? How can they expand on how they can get out on the ocean more and maybe travel, do the things that you did? Yeah.
Yeah, and so I will say I did not travel very much at all in high school. I did almost all of my traveling when I got to college, because it's expensive, and especially traveling out of South Dakota was pretty expensive plane tickets. I think a lot of common advice is to volunteer or just get more opportunities. I want people to know that there are ways to work around that. I wasn't really in a position where I could volunteer a lot. I needed to make a little bit of money. And so I think the biggest thing is to do a lot of research and apply for a lot of things. And what I found was that, because I had, for example, when I got onto ships, I started my first few jobs on ships were actually as a cook, because I had worked in kitchens to help fund some of my travels. So I had a side job where I worked at a restaurant kitchen. And because I could cook, I got my first few jobs on ships. And then as I built the skills to be able to be helpful in what I wanted to do, which was the science, I was able to pay the bills and just get out there as a cook. So sometimes there are ways I think where you can travel and at least get your plane ticket covered if you might take advantage of some of your other skills and you're willing to work hard. But there's some really good listservs out there. And I also think apply for things. For example, Sea Semester has a pretty expensive price tag if you look at it up front, but once you apply, they have financial aid. So I was able to do a lot of the things that I did with financial aid and scholarships. So also consider if there might be financial aid or scholarships that would let you do something that might look really expensive on the front end, but there's actually someone, who really wants to make sure you get out there, whether or not you might be able to afford the plane ticket or whatever that experience costs.
I hear you. Great advice. Thank you so much. I know I did a volunteer opportunity that took me to Alaska as well, and they were willing to pay my plane ticket, but that is not always the case. So volunteering your time, sometimes you can really reap those benefits. And also like being willing to cook. So participants, think of those skills that you want to really work on that could be really valuable to help you get more experiences like that. And Kate also dropped a link to the Oregon Coast STEM Hub scholarships and internships link. So folks, go ahead and just check that out. Back to Kelsey though, what is the most interesting like planktonic discovery that you've come across, like maybe in your samples or just in general, if I can put you on the hot seat on that one?
For sure. I think the coolest thing that I found was a paper nautilus. Oh, I wish I could find a photo of it. But they are absolutely gorgeous. They have a whorled shell that looks like a nautilus, but it's actually an octopus that has a shell. And so it swims and it has this shell. And we found it way out in the middle of the ocean. And I had seen their shells before when they have they've died and the shell comes up to the surface, but I'd never seen one alive. So we had one alive, we kept it in the lab for a couple of hours, and then we put it back out so that it could hopefully survive. But those are found pretty deep in the ocean. So it had probably come up at night a little bit shallower than usual, got caught in one of our nets, and then ended up on the ship. I'll look for a photo I can put in the chat of that. But yeah, paper nautilus is
Paper nautilus. That is too cool, Kelsey. Wow. Okay. I'm sure there's probably so many that come to your mind too. And so what I believe this question came in when you were introducing foraminifera. And so I think that the question is, what do forams, I call them forams. What do they feed on?
Oh, that's a really great question, because all of the species feed on a few different things. There are some foraminifera that actually have little algae that live inside their shell with them, kind of like how coral have zooxanthellae or algae that live inside of coral. So there are forams that float at the surface and they provide a little home for algae. And so the algae photosynthesize and share nutrients with the forams, and the forams are thought to provide a home for the algae. And then there's other forams that just feed on, the fancy word would be detritus, or just kind of like the stuff, the like dead stuff that's in the ocean. And there are others that are thought to be a little bit more of predators, and they have these spines or kind of like mucousy filaments, and they can actually capture other plankton and pull it in and then kind of digest it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. And so I'm going to, one more question that's going to be a multi-parter. So you could call it two questions, but kind of you've shown how you are on research vessels for some time, for part of the time. You're looking through a microscope in the lab for part of the time, maybe doing some other things part of the time, computer work, say. So how much do you actually spend time on at sea versus in the lab looking under a microscope versus other tasks, but then also incorporating how has COVID impacted all of that?
Yes. So currently I go out on research cruises a couple of times a year, and those research cruises are anywhere from 1 to 2 or 3 weeks. So I probably spend a couple months a year at sea. About 2 years ago in the spring, I got an opportunity to go to Taiwan and actually live on an island off of Taiwan for a month. And we were scuba diving for forams and then keeping them alive and culturing them. And we were supposed to go back and do that this May. So I think the biggest thing that I've seen with COVID is that I had a few cruises planned, some of them right off the Oregon coast out of Newport, and this big field season to Taiwan that were canceled due to COVID. The rest of the time, I'm still taking a few classes. So I spend most of my time in Corvallis. I usually go into campus every day. I have an office. I do a lot of work on a computer. I do a fair amount of work under a microscope. I work with a pretty big lab group, so I have, you know, a bunch of friends who I'm usually collaborating with. So that's really fun. A lot of meetings for things I'm involved in, and then really gear up for that 1 to 2 months a year that I get to spend out at sea.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I really do appreciate this last slide of yours that is kind of highlighting some of your tips and advice. So thank you for your presentation and for the insight that you've provided at how different experiences can really reveal interests that you never thought you had, or maybe even learn what you don't like too. So a lot of our presenters are just say yes to things. And so I'm sure Kelsey would agree with that. So thank you so much for your time.